So for the last couple of weeks, we've been nailing down the very basics of what we're going to be working with this term in SQL Server. Um, we talked about data types, and we now have a data types reference sheet that we can look to when we need to. For example, if I went to content categories, notes and references, I have my quick reference sheet here, which I'm not going to open at the moment, but it is available to you when you need to think about data types, at least until you get the hang of it on your own. There's also some summary notes here for modeling and table design. So we did some diagramming in a sense, and we learned how to do an entity model and what its higher purpose is, because eventually it will be used in database diagrams, which will help us to get a high-level overview of how all of our tables interact with each other. Then we also learned about table design charts, which are sort of single-page document type things for us to plan the steps going from an kind of that high-level entity model to a more specific, descriptive model of what our tables look like. So we end up with data types and so on. We have been working with the MMORPG MMORPG.com course case. So I'm going to I'm in the wrong week here. In the week 2 folder from our in-class content, we have a design solution here. We kind of did that activity together, and now I've just got it downloadable just so we have it available. And I will put it in the content categories sooner or later. It's just not there just yet. It may be after I'm finished uploading these videos. So for now, I'm going to click on here, which I've already done, and we're going to end up with this document. You may remember there were a couple of typos. The typos have been repaired, so now we've got the correct field name here and the correct data type here. We've discussed already why we chose the data types we chose, so we're not going to go into detail on that right now, but I do want to do a quick review of the create statement because we haven't spent a whole lot of time with it. So I just want to remind you here, we've got our table design, and this is sort of the step that takes us from just the general concept, what fields we need to track, to something more specific like what data types that we need to use with our fields. We're also assigning an identity column here, and we kind of discussed what that is in class, but I will give you a quick overview as well. But let's look at a create table statement. I'm going to create table game. Why game? Because that's the name that we determined our entity would have during our design process. Next, we have to list out all of our fields along with their data types and any other modifiers that might go along with them. So we have our game ID. Let me just make that a little bit smaller so that it fits on. There we go. Now we can see everything on the screen. All right. So it's an integer, it's an identity field, and we'll put in the 1-1 even though it's technically a default, just so we're aware that we can change that. It's also sometimes good just to have some explicit things in our code so that anybody else looking at it can skip the assumptions and know exactly what we intended. The third column, the constraints column, which currently has only the primary key constraint in it, we're going to deal with after we've listed out all of our columns. So do not put the keywords primary key here. The database will not complain at you, at least not yet, but we want to have a lot more control over naming our primary key, and we also want a syntax that we'll be able to use later on for something called a compound primary key, but I'm not going to get into that today. Just know that the syntax that we're going to use for assigning a primary key is the better and more high control way for us to do it. So let's just finish listing out our field definitions. You'll notice that I put the name of the field followed by the data type. In the case of our identity field, I also put in the identity modifier keywords. And then at the very end of my definition, each of my definitions finish off with a comma. So game ID, int, identity, comma. There's no commas in between, just one at the end when I'm finished putting in those 3 pieces or 2 pieces of information in the rest of the field's case. So game name, then I have varchar 75 as the data type, then I put the comma. So no commas in between or you'll get some broken code. Just watch. If I did this, I would get all kinds of red error lines telling me something is wrong. I look over here, it says definition for game name must include a data type. Well, there you go. That should include the data type afterwards. If I hover over here, I also get the definition for column varchar must include a data type. So the engine thinks that we're trying to name a column varchar. So there's a couple of hints for some of the errors you might hit if you put some extra commas in there. Now what would happen if you missed a comma is, let's put game genre and varchar 25, and we missed a comma. You'll notice a couple of errors start here, and the first error is incorrect syntax near game genre. When you get a incorrect syntax near something, look both before and after and during. So near kind of means around, right? The first thing I would do is I would kind of do a reverse reading order thing. So if I press left with my mouse, I go in reverse reading order, right? Well, the last thing I did just before that red underline was make the other column definition. And if I look closely, I'll notice that I was missing that comma. And that should fix all the errors from this point forward. You'll also notice that when the comma was missing, I had two underlines. It also says incorrect syntax near 25. If I tried to deal with this incorrect syntax here, I'd be dealing with an error that doesn't exist. And that's because it's sort of IntelliSense sort of has a cascading effect. When the first error occurs, it often causes misinterpretation of later code. So my suggestion will always be that you make sure to deal with the top leftmost error that you have. So the first error that you find in reading order in your code, and once you've dealt with that, work your way forward, because often fixing one will get rid of the error indicators for the rest of your issues. Okay, so let's move through the rest of this quickly. I'll fast forward and we'll get back to you. Okay, so now we've listed all of our columns with their data types, which means that we've listed our column definitions. That's what this entire thing before the comma is, a definition. Next thing we have to deal with is our constraints. And constraints we'll always deal with at the bottom of our create table statement. Except for when we're dealing with null and not null, which we haven't dealt with yet. We haven't just talked about in class yet, so we'll get to that. Right now, I'm just going to focus on the primary key constraint, which is the only one we really know. So we know that game ID is the primary key. For the record, if you put an identity specification on any column, it must be the primary key. So take that for what it's worth. So we know that game ID needs to be the primary key. I don't need my table design right now. I want a little bit more screen space so that I can type in my code for you guys here. I'm going to put in a constraint, and anytime you put in a constraint, we start with the constraint keyword and then give our constraint a name. The naming convention we're going to use is in three parts. The first part is a quick abbreviation indicating the type of constraint we're putting in. In this case, it's a primary key, so we're putting in PK. Then we're going to put in the name of our table. Then we're going to put in the name of our primary key column for primary key constraints. This third part it's a little bit fluid, so depending on which constraint type we're creating, we might change that. For primary keys, we follow up our constraint name with the primary key keywords, a set of brackets, and a reference to the column on which we want to put the primary key constraint. And there you have it. That is a complete create table statement for the game table. Okay, so let's have another quick look at our Object Explorer. I'm currently using this home database here that I showed in a previous how to log in example. You'll notice that if I open up my tables subfolder, again, they're not really folders, but that's the terminology we'll use. In my database here at home. By the way, if you're not sure how to set up at home, there are another set of videos. You can find those on Blackboard. Content categories, video content, and here's installing SQL and logging in at home. You can see here's logging into SSMS locally. That's the instructions for logging in at home. If you haven't installed it, there are also installation instructions in video form to go along with your written form. All right, back to this. So this is our create table statement. If I hit run on it right now, so you notice I highlighted it. That's something I recommend you do. So you'll notice I ran the create table game statement. It says commands completed successfully, but my table's not showing up. I've already opened up my database, looked at my tables folder, and what happens is even though the work is done on the server, I have the server and the client on my home machine, but the architecture is designed such that the server might serve hundreds, even thousands of people at the same time. So if every time somebody made a change, the server sent those changes to all 1,000 computers, it would result in traffic jams, if you will, on the network, along with possibly people getting information they just don't need at that particular time. So what we have is a situation where, as the database administrator, we request information from the database when things have changed. And to do that, it's really simple. We just right-click on tables or right-click on our database, and we click refresh. And you'll see it sometimes takes a moment, as you saw just there. It goes to our server, says, please give me all the information about my tables so that I know what my tables look like, and we can get a snapshot again of what our tables look like. So we have all of our columns, the primary key is there with its name that we gave to it, and that's all we need to know for the moment. That's it for this video. I'm going to move on to some action queries in the next video.